ready to look at some main theories of consciousness and their problems. And we'll start by looking at two extremes, two theories that are on each side of the scale, because that will explain some main problems and make it clear why the different sort of intermediary positions, how they try to solve the problems. So typically one starts a presentation like this by presenting Descartes and his substance dualism. Descartes was a philosopher who lived from 1596 to 1650, and he said that there's a strong distinction between the body and the soul, which he called it, or consciousness, as we can call it, and he had plenty of good arguments for this. They do certainly seem very different. There are many things that you can say about the body that you can't say about the soul or consciousness, that you can divide up the body into pieces, for instance, but not the soul, or that the body has extension, but our thoughts, they don't seem to have extension. We don't say that I had this 10 centimeter long thought today. And it seems we can think of one without the other. We can think of a body which is not conscious, or consciousness without the body, which would seem difficult or strange if they're just identical. So these were some of his arguments. He says that consciousness and the physical is two very different things, whereas reductive physicalism is at the other end, saying that it's just the same. No, we can reduce consciousness to something physical. That's why it's called reductive physicalism. And that came as a response to the main problem that Descartes had, namely the interaction problem. Understanding how can there be interaction between the soul and the body if they're so different. How can it be the case that if I hit my finger with a hammer, why should the soul hurt then? Why should it care about what happens to this physical body? Or how is a non-physical soul able to move a body around? How is it connected to the body if they're so different? Is it just flying around with me as I walk? And if I get into an airplane, does the soul have to speed up to hang along? Or how does that work? So Descartes struggled with that problem. He suggested after a while that soul and body was connected in the brain, in glandula pinealis, a place in the brain, but of course it doesn't solve the problem just to point at a physical place. Reductive physicalism came as a reaction to this and said we can solve the interaction problem if we just say that consciousness is physical, and then there's no problem in understanding how two physical things can interact, because physical things, they interact all the time. So it solved the interaction problem, but it got another problem, namely that consciousness seemed to have a lot of properties that we don't see in physical things. Physical things, they consist of elementary particles, but it doesn't seem that our conscious experience does that. Physical things, they are observable from a third-person perspective, but conscious experiences are only observable from the first-person perspective. Physical things have extension, whereas consciousness does not. They have location, where it's hard to say that the thought is located at a specific place, etc. So there are so many things that seem very different and inconsistent between physical things and conscious experiences. So then, if you just say, well, it's physical, it seems that you're not explaining anything. Instead, you're explaining it away. You're just denying that there is this different thing at all. But then you should be able to explain why. If it's physical, why does it have all these seemingly non-physical properties? Because if you just say it just is physical, that's like if we want to understand how can we understand mathematical numbers, how can we understand number 4, and you say, well, it's just because number 4 is physical. Well, you can't just say that without explaining how does that work, where is it, how did it come about. If you don't say anything about, then you're just putting a name or a stamp. You're not explaining anything. You need to show us how this works in more detail, how things are connected. And of course one can say we don't understand, but in the future we will. But nobody knows what will happen in the future. Maybe the future will make it even clearer that it's not physical. So we have to ask what is best justified today, and if it's best justified today to say that consciousness seems to have all these non-physical properties, then we should say, well, consciousness is non-physical. That seems to be best justified today, even if the future could tell us that we were wrong, but the future can always tell us that we're wrong in one or another way in all questions. So the question is, what's best justified today? These problems of the interaction problem for substance dualism and the problem of explaining away, or not explaining at all, for reductive physicalism, these are broadly recognized as problems. So most people try to find some intermediary position or intermediate solutions. Yeah. So, for instance, you have non-reductive physicalism, which does not want to say that it's just identical to consciousness is just identical to brain activity. But what is it then? Because it's a bit wide term. There are different kinds of non-reductive physicalists. They want to retain this point that it seems that the brain has an important role in shaping our conscious experiences. But some non-reductive physicalists will still say that consciousness is physical. And then they get the problem of explaining why does it have all these seemingly non-physical properties. Some non-reductive physicalists will say that consciousness is not physical. For instance, property dualism, distinguishing between properties that are physical or conscious. But then they get the interaction problem again. One way of trying to avoid the interaction problem is epiphenomenalism, which says that, well, on the one hand, consciousness is non-physical, but on the other hand, we can avoid the interaction problem by just saying that consciousness is an epiphenomenon. It just follows brain activity like a shadow, but it doesn't have any causal role. But very few are willing to accept that as well. It seems strange that evolution should select for consciousness for all if it doesn't have any causal role. It seems that it does have a causal role. So few people also call themselves epiphenomenalists when it comes to consciousness. Emergentism is the view that when certain physical processes become complex enough, consciousness will emerge from that. And one can show other examples of how complex systems have properties that their parts doesn't have. So for instance, water, we won't say that just one molecule of H2O is wet, but we can say that water is wet. But emergentism has the problem when it comes to consciousness that in other cases of emergentism, we understand how water, for instance, get the property of being wet when these molecules move around like they do. But consciousness seems so radically different from just the brain activity. So either if you have a weak emergentism, and then consciousness is just something physical, and you get the problem of how to explain the non-physical properties of consciousness. But if you say that it's something radically different that emerges, then the problem is to understand how. How can that happen? Because it doesn't happen in the other cases of emergentism. So you need to say something more instead of just it just happens, because that's not an explanation. And we need to know more details about how that works. Otherwise, it just becomes a mystery. Finally, panpsychism is the idea that everything is conscious, or that there is a rudimentary or kind of consciousness in everything, even down to the smallest particles and electrons, etc. And so that's a way to try to avoid the interaction problem and say that, well, it's just physical and consciousness all the way down to the bottom. That could seem to give you a interaction problem at the bottom. So how do they interact then in the electron? Because often, even in the best cases or best theories of panpsychism, it's quite vague what it means to say that consciousness is inside or intrinsically there, or where is this consciousness in the electron, and etc. And usually they won't say that it's our kind of consciousness. The electron doesn't have an experience of being bored. This electron life, it's not, I can't find the meaning, etc. So it's a very different kind of consciousness. But does it then deserve to be called consciousness, or how does it work that this very different small parts of consciousness can combine into the kind of conscious experiences and selves that we have? It seems strange that everything should have this consciousness that we can find no traces of, when it seems that you need to have a quite complex brain before there can be consciousness at all. So that's a reason to think that, well, there's something more advanced required for there to be consciousness, instead of thinking that there's consciousness everywhere. So these were some problems that the different theories have. And especially this interaction problem is a problem that we're going to look into in the next video. The big problem of mental causation, or how can consciousness have a causal role, which it's on the one hand seems that it must have, because it's been selected by illusion, and on the other hand seems it can't have, for different reasons that I'll tell you about in the next video.